In this devotional, I'm going to share with you three thoughts from 2 Samuel chapter 1, verses 11 through 16, where I'll ask the question, why did David mourn for Saul? 2 Samuel chapter 1, verses 11 through 16 says, Then David took hold of his clothes and tore them, and so did all the men who were with him. And they mourned and wept and fasted until evening for Saul and for Jonathan his son, and for the people of the Lord, and for the house of Israel, because they had fallen by the sword. And David said to the young man who told him, Where do you come from? And he answered, I am the son of a sojourner, an Amalekite. And David said to him, How is it you were not afraid to put your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed? Then David called one of the young men and said, Go execute him. And he struck him down so that he died. And David said to him, Your blood be on your head. For your own mouth has testified against you, saying, I have killed the Lord's anointed. David's relationship with Saul is one that's really difficult to get your head around, because at some points it seems like they're friends. It seems like they're buddies. It seems like they're partners, that they're helping each other out. And at some points, Saul is trying to kill him. He's flinging spears at him, trying to pin him to the wall. This kind of thing is taking place. So David, who's really, at this point, an enemy of Saul, is terribly upset when he finds out that Saul has been killed. David, who had fought with Saul, who had run from Saul, who had tried to evade getting killed by Saul for such a long time, is grieved by the fact that Saul has been killed. And it's a little bit difficult for us to really understand why. So here are three thoughts from 2 Samuel chapter 1, verses 11 through 16, answering the question, why did David mourn for Saul? Thought number one, love of Jonathan. And when I say love of Jonathan, I mean David and Jonathan, they were absolutely best friends. They loved each other. They were very profoundly close. And Jonathan died along with Saul. But it isn't just his love of Jonathan that makes him mourn for Saul. David had love for Saul too. Granted, it was one of these relationships that's profoundly difficult to understand. It's very complex. He recognized that he's the Lord's anointed, that Saul is special. So David doesn't want Saul to die. So I think that David is really feeling some deep sorrow at the loss of these people. There's also this idea that the king of Israel is slain. The king of Israel is dead. And because David loves the people of Israel, he knows that the king being killed is going to be profoundly difficult for his countrymen. It's the love of Jonathan, the love of Saul, the love of the people of Israel that causes David to mourn for this man who had tried to kill him multiple times. Thought number two, political security. There's this theory going around, and it's really interesting, that most of David's actions are very well thought out to establish himself as king with very few people trying to take the throne away from him. And you can go and you can look this up. It's really fascinating. The idea is that David constantly is saying the right thing at the right time when it comes to other rulers, to minimize the risk of their family members coming after him, to minimize the amount of trouble that he'll have when establishing his own throne. So David might be mourning for Saul and doing so publicly to make sure that the people know he didn't want Saul to die, to let all of the folks know that it saddens him that the king of Israel is dead, and it's with a heavy heart that he takes on the throne. Political security might be one of the reasons why David is actively and publicly grieving for Saul, the king who was trying to kill him. Thought number three, the Lord's anointed. And this, I think, because it gets repeated so many times, is probably the best reason why David is mourning for Saul. It's because Saul was anointed. He was anointed at the command of God to be king over Israel. God chose Saul to be the king. The fact that Saul was chosen by God gives us a big indicator that David is concerned over who God chooses to be a ruler. Now, David, he was anointed by God too. He also is one of the Lord's anointed. So he might also have in mind this idea that you don't kill the Lord's anointed, which We'll play into that political security idea. But even more than that, David is a man after God's own heart. He is somebody who is interested in what God is doing. He's interested in God's law, in God's will for the people of Israel. And because of that, he doesn't want to end the life. And he's saddened by the fact that the Lord's anointed here is dead. There's plenty of reasons for David to be grieving over the loss of Saul. It wasn't as if they were simply enemies. His love of Jonathan, his love for the people of Israel, the establishment of some political security for himself, but ultimately a love for God and his actions for the people of Israel would all be causes for David to mourn the loss of Israel's first king, Saul. These three thoughts come from the assigned reading of 2 Samuel chapters 1 through 4. If you'd like to read through the Bible with me, you can do so by subscribing to this channel, by clicking on the link in the description, or by joining the Facebook group Through the Bible, where we are reading the text of Scripture together.